Have you ever been locked out of your own home? Not because you forgot your keys, but because someone with a petty grudge and a clipboard decided you no longer deserved access? That's what happened to me. One Tuesday afternoon, my gate code stopped working. My key fob was dead. I was standing at the entrance to Live Oak Creek Estates, the very picture of suburban tranquility I'd bought into, effectively barred from my own driveway by an HOA president who thought a minor bylaw infraction was grounds for exile. Her name was Brenda, and her weapon of choice was the community's access control system. What Brenda, in her beige pantsuit-fueled fever dream of absolute power, didn't remotely comprehend was that she wasn't just picking a fight with a retired software engineer who liked to keep his lawn tidy. She was picking a fight with a man who had spent 30 years designing, building, and breaking enterprise-level network security systems. She thought she was revoking a password. She had no idea she had just initiated a hostile takeover. This isn't just a story about getting even with a power-tripping HOA board. This is a story about how I didn't just fight the system. I bought the whole damn thing, lock, stock, and keypad. Have you ever dealt with someone who wields a tiny sliver of authority like it's a royal scepter? I'd love to hear about it, because you'll appreciate where this is going. My initial sin, the transgression that set Brenda on her warpath, was leaving my recycling bin at the curb for 26 hours instead of the HOA-mandated 24. I received a crisp, passive-aggressive letter with a $10 fine. I paid it. A month later, a contractor I'd hired to repair a roof shingle arrived at 7:55 a.m., a full 5 minutes before the approved 8 a.m. start time for construction work. Another letter, another fine, this time $50, with a highlighted sentence about respecting the community's peace and quiet. The final straw, apparently, was a small get-together I hosted for my daughter's college graduation. According to Brenda, who must have been peering through her blinds with a stopwatch, 3 of my guest cars were parked on the street for 2 hours and 15 minutes, exceeding the 2-hour limit. That's what led to the shutdown. The official letter, tucked under my windshield wiper like a common flyer, informed me that due to a pattern of repeated and willful violations of community bylaws, my access privileges had been indefinitely suspended pending a formal review by the board. It was signed with a flourish by Brenda, president. I stood there, locked out a multi-million-dollar development I paid a premium to live in, all because of a trash can, a roofer, and a few parked cars. The absurdity was staggering, but as I stared at the impassive keypad, the initial frustration began to curdle into something else, something colder and far more strategic. Brenda thought she was teaching me a lesson in compliance. I decided it was time to teach her a lesson in consequences. My first move was to try the path of reason, a path I quickly discovered was a dead-end street in Brenda's world. I called her. The conversation was a masterclass in condescension. "Alex," she said, her voice dripping with false sympathy, "rules are what separate us from anarchy. We can't make exceptions. If we make one for you, everyone will want one." And she suggested I could attend the next monthly HOA meeting in 3 weeks to appeal the decision. Until then, I was to make my own arrangements for entry and exit, helpfully reminding me that tailgating another resident through the gate was a finable offense. My next step was that very meeting. I prepared a calm, logical presentation. I walked into the community center's sterile conference room, where Brenda and her 2 board cronies, a retired accountant named Gerald and a woman named Carol who seemed to communicate only through disapproving frowns, sat like a tribunal. I acknowledged my infractions, explained the circumstances, and pointed out that revoking primary access to a resident's home was a wildly disproportionate and potentially hazardous punishment. What if there was an emergency? What if I needed to get to my wife, who has a heart condition? Brenda simply smiled a tight, reptilian smile. "The board has discussed your case at length, Alex," she announced, as if speaking of a dangerous criminal. "And we have voted to uphold the suspension. Your lack of regard for the rules poses a continuous challenge to the community's integrity." Gerald nodded sagely, and Carol's frown deepened. I was dismissed. The very next day, a certified letter arrived from the HOA's lawyer, formally warning me against any unauthorized access attempts and outlining a list of escalating fines. That's when Brenda truly escalated. She sent a community-wide email newsletter with a prominent section titled Upholding Our Standards, which detailed, without using my name, the board's firm and decisive action against a resident who chronically refused to respect our shared community values. The humiliation was the point. Having to sit at the gate and call a neighbor to buzz me in, watching other residents drive past with looks of pity or suspicion. It was all part of her plan. She wanted to break my spirit. But Brenda fundamentally misjudged her target. She wasn't breaking my spirit. She was fueling my engine. That evening, sitting in my car waiting for a grocery delivery truck to let me in, I decided the game was over. Her game, anyway. It was time to start a new one with my own rules. The transition from frustrated resident to determined strategist happened in an instant. It was a flick of a switch, the moment I realized that arguing with Brenda was like trying to reason with a firewall protocol. You don't argue with it. You find its vulnerabilities and gain root access. My quiet retirement was officially over. That night, I didn't stew in anger. I went to my home office, fired up my workstation, and began my real work. The first step was a full-spectrum analysis of the battlefield, the gate itself. I had dozens of high-resolution photos of the keypad, the RFID sensor, and the main control box taken on my walks. A few minutes of cross-referencing model numbers and FCC ID tags etched onto the hardware gave me my first critical piece of intelligence. The system was manufactured by a company called OmniAccess, but the installation and, more importantly, the ongoing service management contract was held by a regional firm, Guardian Gate Solutions. My investigation deepened. Guardian Gate Solutions was not a massive, faceless corporation. It was a privately held S-corporation based 2 counties over. I spent the next several hours in a deep dive, pulling public records, corporate filings from the Secretary of State, and UCC liens. I built a complete financial and structural picture of the company. They were moderately successful, with contracts for about 50 gated communities and a few commercial properties across the state. They were profitable, but not wildly so. Then came the breakthrough. On an obscure forum for physical security installers, I found a thread from 6 months prior. An installer who used to work for Guardian mentioned that the owner, a man named Marcus Thorne, was in his late 60s and had been talking about retirement for years. The post mentioned Thorne had no children interested in the business and had quietly floated the idea of a sale, but was wary of being lowballed by larger competitors. That was it. The aha moment. It hit me with the force of a physical blow. Brenda's power wasn't in the HOA bylaws. It was in the service contract with Guardian Gate Solutions. She was a client who could be managed. But why be a client when you could be the owner? The idea was so audacious, so beautifully absolute, that I laughed out loud in my silent office. Brenda thought her domain was this little neighborhood. She had no idea I was about to redraw the map of her entire world. The objective was no longer to get my gate code back. The new objective was to own the company that issued them. The plan crystallized with breathtaking clarity. It was a 3-phase operation. Phase 1, acquisition. Phase 2, control. Phase 3, re-education. Brenda and her board were about to get a masterclass in corporate strategy delivered by the very resident they were trying to bully into submission. While she was busy drafting her next newsletter about the importance of lawn height, I was mapping out a leveraged buyout. My first call was to a boutique mergers and acquisitions firm in the city, run by a sharp, discreet woman named Evelyn Reed, whom I'd worked with during my tech days when we acquired smaller startups. I laid out the target, Guardian Gate Solutions, and my intent to purchase it outright. I framed it as a strategic investment in the local infrastructure services sector, a stable asset for my portfolio. My personal motivation remained my own business. Evelyn, professional to the core, didn't ask personal questions. She saw a motivated buyer with deep pockets and a clear target. Her team got to work immediately, preparing a confidential, unsolicited expression of interest. While Evelyn's firm was doing its delicate dance of corporate courtship, Brenda was, predictably, becoming more brazen. I received another violation notice, this time with a blurry photo of a single weed near my mailbox, circled in red marker. The notice informed me I had 48 hours to remedy the botanical infraction or face a $100 fine. It was so petty, so performatively tyrannical, that I almost felt a sense of pity for her. She was so engrossed in her microscopic kingdom, completely unaware of the tectonic plates shifting beneath her feet. She thought she was winning a war of attrition. She couldn't fathom that I was preparing to drop a financial nuke. The reports from Evelyn were promising. Marcus Thorne, the owner of Guardian, was indeed ready to retire. He was intrigued by the anonymous inquiry. He was tired of the grind of dealing with demanding clients like as Evelyn's team discover my very own HOA. The preliminary financials showed a healthy, if slightly stagnant, business. It was the perfect target, small enough to acquire quietly, but big enough to hold the keys to Brenda's little castle. My plan was no longer a fantasy. It was a viable, funded, and rapidly progressing corporate maneuver. The acquisition process moved faster than I could have hoped. Marcus Thorne was ready to sell, and I was ready to buy. Through Evelyn's firm, we presented an offer that was both generous and surgically precise. It was an all-cash deal, 20% above the most optimistic valuation of Guardian Gate Solutions, contingent on a swift, 30-day closing and a strict non-disclosure agreement. It was an offer designed not for negotiation, but for acceptance. For Marcus, a man looking to trade spreadsheets for fishing poles, it was the perfect exit. He accepted within 48 hours. The next few weeks were a blur of due diligence. While I was still playing the role of the disenfranchised resident, politely waiting at the gate, waving to neighbors, dutifully pulling the weed by my mailbox, my legal and financial teams were combing through every contract, every P&L statement, and every liability policy in Guardian's portfolio. The irony was exquisite. In one of the folders, they found the service agreement for Live Oak Creek Estates. I read every line. I saw the clauses that gave the client administrator, a role assigned to the HOA president, the ability to add or remove resident credentials at will. That was the clause Brenda had weaponized. It was a vulnerability in the contract, and I was about to patch it permanently. The day of the closing arrived. I drove to a nondescript office building downtown, the headquarters of the law firm handling the transaction. Marcus Thorne was there, a friendly-looking man with tired eyes who seemed immensely relieved. We exchanged pleasantries, signed a mountain of documents, and with the final signature and a quiet confirmation from the bank that the wire transfer was complete, it was done. I shook his hand, the former owner of Guardian Gate Solutions. I walked out of that building as its new, silent owner. The first thing I did was sit in my car and pull out my phone. I logged into the Guardian system, using the super administrator credentials my team had already prepared. I found my own name, Alex Miller, in the Live Oak Creek database. Next to it, the status read, deactivated. I tapped the screen, changed the status to active, and granted my account's system override privileges that couldn't be altered by a client-level administrator. I drove home. When I reached the gate, I didn't have to wait. I keyed in my old code. The light turned green. The gate swung silently open. It was the quietest, most satisfying victory I had ever experienced. But this was just phase one. My first official act as the new owner of Guardian Gate Solutions was to call an all-hands meeting with the company's senior management. I introduced myself not as a vengeful resident, but as a technology executive focused on modernization and risk mitigation. My goal, I told the small group of managers and technicians, is to make this the most professional and legally defensible security service provider in the state. My demeanor was calm, corporate, and utterly detached from the suburban drama that had set this all in motion. I then initiated a full review of client service protocols to minimize corporate liability. Naturally, I decided to use the Live Oak Creek Estates, HOA, as our first case study. I called the account manager, a man named Dave, into my new office. Dave, I was looking at the access log for this account. I see a resident's credentials were recently revoked. What was the security threat? Dave shifted uncomfortably. Well, sir, there wasn't a security threat, exactly. The HOA president, Brenda, she said the resident was a real problem. Constant bylaw violations. She wanted his access cut off until he learned to comply. He was parroting Brenda's narrative perfectly, just as I'd expected. I leaned back in my chair, feigning deep concern. So we, as a security company, acted as the enforcement arm for a client's internal, non-security related disputes. I let the question hang in the air. Our insurance carrier would have a field day with that. The potential for a lawsuit, wrongful eviction, restriction of access, it's immense. I saw the understanding dawn on Dave's face. He was thinking about liability, not HOA politics. That afternoon, I dictated a new, company-wide policy directive. Effective immediately, Guardian Gate Solutions would no longer honor client requests to deactivate a resident's primary access credentials for non-payment of dues or bylaw infractions. Such actions, the policy stated, could only be triggered by a verifiable, documented security threat reported to law enforcement or by a formal court order. To enforce this, we rolled out a software update to our client-facing administrative portal. This update quietly removed the button that allowed client admins like Brenda to deactivate users. She could add new residents, she could edit guest lists, but the power to exile had been surgically excised from her digital kingdom. I had reactivated my own access. Now, I had ensured she could never take it away again. The trap was now baited. All I had to do was wait for the queen bee to realize her stinger had been removed. The wait was surprisingly short. It took Brenda exactly 2 days to notice. I imagine the scene vividly. Her sitting at her little desk, logging into the Guardian admin portal to check on the status of her problem resident, only to see my name listed as active. Confusion would turn to indignation. She would have clicked furiously, searching for the deactivate button she had wielded with such glee, only to find it gone. Her first call was to Dave, the account manager. I had prepped him for this exact scenario. On my instruction, he had a recording of the call forwarded to my personal email. Her voice was shrill, incredulous. "What is this? I can't remove the non-compliant resident. The button is gone." Dave, bless his professional soul, was perfectly calm. "Yes, Ms. Johnson. As per our new corporate risk management policy, we can no longer allow client administrators to unilaterally revoke resident access for non-security issues. It's a liability concern for us." There was a sputtering silence on Brenda's end. "Liability? Your liability is to your client. I am your client. Your company will do as I direct." Dave was unflappable. "I understand your frustration, ma'am. However, our legal counsel has been very clear. If you have a resident who poses a genuine security risk, please file a police report and forward it to us. Otherwise, access disputes are a civil matter between the resident and the HOA. This is unacceptable." Brenda shrieked. "I demand to speak to whoever is responsible for this insane new policy. I want to talk to the owner of this company. Right now." This was the moment. The checkmate move I had been patiently awaiting. Dave delivered his lines perfectly. "The new owner is taking a very hands-on approach to client relations, Ms. Johnson. He believes major policy shifts like this deserve a personal explanation. He has authorized me to inform you that he will be attending your next scheduled HOA board meeting to personally address your concerns and discuss the future of our service contract." I could almost hear the gears turning in Brenda's head. An in-person meeting, a chance for her to verbally browbeat some corporate suit into submission in front of her board. She agreed instantly, her voice filled with smug anticipation. The meeting was set for the following Wednesday. The stage was set for the final act. She thought she was summoning a subordinate to be reprimanded. She had no idea she was arranging her own public execution. The community center conference room was exactly as I remembered it from my own shaming a few weeks prior. The same stale air, the same flickering fluorescent lights. Brenda sat at the head of the long table, flanked by her loyal board members, Gerald and Carol. She had an air of supreme confidence, a warrior queen ready to defend her territory from an invading corporate drone. She had even invited a few other residents, likely to witness her triumph and reinforce her authority. The agenda item was vendor contract review. Guardian Gate Solutions. Brenda cleared her throat and began. "As some of you know," she said, her voice resonating with manufactured gravity, "we have been experiencing some troubling and unprofessional changes from our security provider. They have recently instituted a new policy that hamstrings this board's ability to enforce our community's bylaws. The owner of this company has come here tonight to explain this bizarre and unacceptable decision. She looked toward the door expectantly. We will now hear from the representative of Guardian Gate Solutions. That was my cue. I pushed the door open and walked in. I wore a simple dark suit, no tie. I carried a laptop. Every eye in the room turned to me. I saw confusion first, especially from the other residents. Then I looked at Brenda. Her smug smile froze, then melted away, replaced by a slack-jawed expression of pure, unadulterated shock. The color drained from her face. Gerald squinted, as if his eyes were deceiving him. Carol's perpetual frown deepened into a chasm of disbelief. I walked calmly to the front of the room, set my laptop on the table, and connected it to the projector. "Good evening, Brenda," I said, my voice even and calm. The room was utterly silent. "You wanted to speak with the owner of Guardian Gate Solutions." "That's me." I let the statement settle. A stone dropped into a still pond. I turned to the small audience. "My name is Alex Miller, and as of 3 weeks ago, I acquired 100% of the company that runs your gate." Then I clicked the first slide of my presentation onto the screen. The title read, "A Case Study in Risk Management and Corporate Restructuring." The presentation was concise, brutal, and entirely professional. The first slide was a simple timeline. It showed the date of my recycling bin violation, the date of my contractor's early arrival, and the date of my daughter's graduation party. The next slide showed the HOA's official letter suspending my access. This, I explained, was Exhibit A in my internal risk assessment. An HOA board using my company's security infrastructure as a tool for punitive action in a civil disagreement. Brenda, who had regained a fraction of her composure, finally spoke. This is a conflict of interest. You can't do this." I held up a hand. "On the contrary, Brenda, what you did was the conflict. You weaponized a service meant for security to settle a personal score. My actions, on the other hand, are a textbook example of vertical integration. I identified a critical vulnerability in a system I depended on, so I purchased the vendor to patch it. It's the purest form of capitalism." I clicked to the next slide, which displayed the new Guardian Gate Solutions policy prohibiting punitive lockouts. This is now our company-wide standard, protecting us from liability and our residents from abuse of power. It is not negotiable. Then came the masterstroke. "Now, let's talk about our service contract," I said, turning my full attention to the board. "My legal team has reviewed the existing agreement. It's sloppy and leaves all parties exposed. We will not be renewing it under the current terms." A wave of panic washed over Gerald's face. "You can't just cancel it." I smiled faintly. "You're right. I have a better idea." The final slide appeared. It was titled, "Live Oak Creek Estates, New Service Agreement Proposal." I laid out the new terms. 1. The HOA Board's administrative access would be permanently downgraded to read-only. All access changes would be submitted through a formal ticketing system at Guardian, requiring legal justification. 2. A new Residence Bill of Rights would be appended to the contract, guaranteeing every homeowner unimpeded access unless they posed a direct, verifiable threat to the community. 3. To cover the increased administrative overhead and legal liability demonstrated by the board's past actions, the monthly service fee would be increasing by 50%. And 4. The kicker, should the board decline this new agreement, you are, of course, free to seek another vendor. However, per the original installation contract, the cost to decommission all of Guardian's proprietary hardware and software is the client's responsibility. I put the estimated figure on the screen. It was a 6-figure sum. Brenda was sputtering, a mixture of rage and humiliation rendering her speechless. You can't," she finally managed. I looked her directly in the eye. "I can. You have 2 choices. Sign the new, more expensive contract that strips you of your power, or explain to these residents why their HOA dues are about to triple to pay for an entirely new system. Because you had a problem with my recycling bin." The room was silent, but the verdict was clear on the faces of the other residents. Brenda's reign was over. She hadn't just been outmaneuvered. She'd been acquired, restructured, and rendered obsolete. The aftermath was as swift as it was decisive. The other residents in the room, having witnessed Brenda's petty tyranny laid bare and followed by a corporate checkmate, turned on her. The board, facing a room full of angry homeowners and the barrel of a six-figure decommissioning fee, had no choice. They voted 2-1, with Brenda abstaining in a silent fury, to accept the new service agreement. Her power was gone. The scepter she had wielded with such arrogance had been snapped in two. In the weeks that followed, the story spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. A recall petition was circulated, and it gained signatures with astonishing speed. At an emergency community meeting a month later, Brenda was unceremoniously voted off the board. She sold her house and moved away within 6 months, unable to face the community she had tried to rule with an iron fist. Her downfall was total, a direct result of her own hubris. On a broader scale, my impulsive acquisition had unforeseen positive consequences. The Residence Bill of Rights and the new liability policies I had created for my own protection were implemented across all of Guardian Gate Solutions clients. I started getting calls from residents in other communities thanking me. Apparently, petty tyrants on HOA boards were a widespread plague, and I had inadvertently created the cure. Guardian Gate Solutions flourished, rebranded as a company that prioritized resident security over board politics. It turned out to be a fantastic investment, both financially and philosophically. I reflect on it now, sitting on my back patio, enjoying the peace and quiet I originally sought. I never wanted a war. I wanted a tranquil retirement. But Brenda taught me a valuable lesson. When a bully is using the rules of a broken system against you, sometimes the most effective strategy isn't to fight them on their terms. It's to buy the system, rewrite the rulebook, and create a better game for everyone. I didn't break any laws. I didn't even raise my voice. I used logic, capital, and strategy to dismantle a petty dictatorship. The moral of the story is simple. Be careful who you push. You never know who you're dealing with. The quiet neighbor you underestimate today might just become your new boss tomorrow. So, I'll ask you one last time. What's the most creative way you've ever seen someone turn the tables on a situation that seemed hopeless? Share your stories. It's in these tales of ingenuity that we find the most satisfying kind of justice.